All right, this is a thick ass paper. I mean, I'll be honest. Like this is
Okay, you guys want to jump into it?
yeah, we could hit record because I'm not hosting this paper.
I think we're already recording.
Yeah, we're already recording. That's fine. All
I
right,
know, right?
so
Yeah.
let's just get going. Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich, and I am here once again with my co-host, Dr. Brian Curley, and our recurring victim, Matt Quinn. Thank you, Matt, for being so patient with the two of us and coming back again and again for these things. You really do make this so much more valuable than Brian and I could on our own. And what we were talking about before this started, I'll clip in because it's pretty interesting, but let's not go into that again here. Let's just stick on the topic at hand. So this is a paper that I sent out to, we actually scheduled this a while ago, and I didn't bother to check how many pages this paper was. And when, the day before we were going to do the podcast, Brian and Matt went to look at it. They were like, dude, this thing's 40 pages, 40 plus pages long. We can't do this podcast tomorrow. So we delayed it for a little bit, but I think it's worth it. The paper is Linoleic acid peroxidation, the dominant lipid peroxidation process in low-density lipoprotein and its relationship to chronic diseases. It's by Spitaler. I think his name is Gerhard Spitaler. It's one of the things that I would call foundational. One of the papers I found that's foundational, the sort of thing that you can go back, 5 years from now and you'll read it and you'll be like, oh, this was in there too. And it's one of the ones that I read and has been super helpful in being able to unpack later studies. So for instance, when I heard about ferroptosis, I went back to this paper and I was able to understand what they were talking about in ferroptosis, and also that their initial papers on ferroptosis were wrong and why they were wrong. And we'll get into that a little bit in the course of this paper. So guys, what do you think?
Thick, detailed. I'm getting organic chemistry PTSD from reading this. It's great though. There's just so much to do. We could do like 10 episodes on this or something.
It is very thick.
Yeah.
I've read it before my newborn was here, and I've read it twice since my newborn was here, who's now 10 days old. And I think somewhere in there, I've seen different things every time I've read it. The question I had, actually, the thing that's like the top of my mind is I'm not clear on what this actually even is, right? Like I can pull out a study and go, this is an FFQ survey based study over a period of time. This is the number of people. This is a randomized control trial with people double blind. This is mice, yada, yada. And I actually felt like I was reading a chemistry textbook from school when I was reading this paper. So it feels different than I think the usual literature that's thrown around in an argument in this space.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure even how I would describe what this is. What would you call this?
Well, I think just to start from a doctor perspective is that I think the point that we should start at is that most studies won't say, this is a study about vegetable oil. This is a study about seed oils. And the point here is that it's going to get to these chemical compounds. It's going to describe these lipid peroxidation products. It's going to describe 4-HNE. It's going to describe the HODEs. Tucker can speak to this eloquently, is that what I like about this paper is it says, hey, let's be more specific and talk about where this is coming from.
Right. So as Brian and I have been doing kind of a series on X of late, where you find a paper, and I did one today, in fact, where you find a paper that goes on and on and on about something, and they never mentioned linoleic acid, right? And this was the problem that I had when I started doing research on this myself. So the paper today, here's what I wrote. Playing the game, mentions of lipid hydroperoxide, 62. Mentions of oxidized LDL, 12. mentions of oxidized HDL, 7, mentions of MDA, 3, mentions of HNE, 2, mentions of the word omega, 0, mentions of the word linoleic acid, 0.
Goose
Right?
egg.
So unless you read a paper like Spiteller's paper, you would never look at this paper and say, oh, well, this is something that's describing seed oil toxicity, right? Because they never mention it.
Mm-hmm.
So you need enough of a background in the process of lipid peroxidation so that you can look at more papers and understand, oh, I get it. It's got this keyword in it, right? And I mean, I use HNE for that because it's the most commonly studied one, where if you find, say you think there's an association between something like the Asian flush and bad outcomes, right? If you look up Asian flush or ALDH 2-star-2 and linoleic acid, you're probably going to find nothing. But if you look up that term and HNE, you will find papers about it, right? And then if you know that the primary source of HNE in the human diet is linoleic acid and seed oils, then you can make a connection. Whereas otherwise, you're just going to say, well, this has nothing to do with that, right? Or more likely, you'll never see it in the first place, the way that search engines work now. If you don't have the right terms, you can't find anything, right? So
Tucker, one of my favorite exchanges from you on Twitter X was someone who said, so you're saying all oxidative stress, that's 300,000 references or something. And you were like, yes.
Oh, no, it was great. The guy said, what was the guy said? He's saying, so you're saying basically every paper in obesity is about this. And I was like, that's right. And he said, and you're saying that Tylenol poisoning is due to this. And I was immediately able to find a paper that said exactly that. Tylenol poisoning is caused by omega-6 peroxidation in the liver. Bingo.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you took, for those at home, if you took Tylenol and gave it to someone in the year 1700 and the foods that they were eating naturally, you would have a different effect at different levels compared to someone nowadays, right? Because
and likely they'd be
composition
more
of their.
I mean, it's important to understand Tylenol is the most commonly overdosed drug in the United States,
Yes.
right? And it's possible, although I've never seen it. I may have actually seen it studied. But at any rate, part of the toxic effect of Tylenol seems to be because we're all stuffed full of omega-6 fats.
Yeah.
Right. I think, in fact, I have seen papers that things that prevent omega-6 peroxidation are protective against Tylenol overdose, but I'd have to go back and look at that.
All right.
Anyway,
but excellent. But that's a good basis for looking at this paper. Is it's starting to call out specifically what we're looking at in a lot of other research.
Right, and I think after the last two papers, I realized it was kind of an important background for us all to have and to give to everybody else, so that we don't necessarily have to go through this conversation every time we're looking at a paper, where I can find a paper that never mentions linoleic acid and we can go through and we can understand the process of where these things are coming to, right?
And so I think this speaks to like the foundation of, I think what you're saying is this speaks to the foundational like argument of this area, because so many papers are published and they don't call out they work at such an abstract level that they don't call out seed oils or linoleic acid, and therefore I think then one of the byproducts of that is that I would say like celebrity or social media personalities with medical flavors are like, well, there's no science behind that because they can't find specific abstracts that call those things out. But this is really like understanding the physics of the concrete and why the concrete is the foundation of your house, rather than just saying concrete. This is actually the underlying science and mechanisms. This is a review of of the chemistry behind
that's right. And it will also give you understanding. I mean, I often see papers on X, usually posted by people with a nutrition background, who don't understand this. And they will say something like biomarkers of linoleic acid and diabetes. And they will say, well, look, higher levels of linoleic acid in the diet makes, or higher levels of linoleic acid in the serum means you're less likely to have diabetes, and therefore linoleic acid is good for you and good for diabetes. Well, what they don't understand is that linoleic acid doesn't cause diabetes. What causes diabetes are the oxidized linoleic acids that we're going to discuss in this paper, right? And that is well recognized in the literature. And, there is a great paper, Hodge 2007, that looked at dietary intake of linoleic acid in Australians. And what they found was that what was it again? Increased linoleic acid in the diet correlated with higher rates of diabetes, but it was an inverse relationship in serum, right? So nutritionists will say there's a relationship between linoleic acid in the blood and that in the diet, which is false, right? And they will say, therefore, it's not causing diabetes. But in fact, what's the toxic process is that linoleic acid is turning into something else, right? So when it's going down, that's when you see the disease state begin, not when it's high. Does that make sense?
And to segue into this paper, the topic for today, it talks about how levels of these oxidized products are found in the LDL particle up to like what 10, 100 times more in some cases. So it's almost like this cascade that can happen with folks. It says it
20
in certain disease processes.
20 to 100-fold more. Yes. So it's a
And
massive.
why does that happen in some people and not in others? That's an interesting question we don't have the answer to.
Well, we have some answers. I mean, the ALDH 2*2 mutation means you're going to have a worse effect from less seed oil toxicity, just same thing as alcohol. So at any rate, so there are a bunch of points I want to make here. Let me go back to my notes real quick. So the guy Spitaler starts off the obvious involvement of lipid peroxidation. So what is lipid peroxidation? Lipid peroxidation is the process of oxidizing a fat, right? And all fats are subject to oxidation. That's saturated fats to unsaturated fats. That's why we have candles, right? A candle is composed of fat and waxes, which are also a type of lipid. So, light it up, it's oxidizing, right? In the body, when we talk about lipid peroxidation, because the temperatures are lower, we're generally talking about unsaturated fats, right? Those are the ones that are going to oxidize under the condition of the body. So, as he said, as he was saying, the obvious involvement of LPO processes in the majority of severe diseases, and I think he's referring to chronic diseases here, stimulated worldwide efforts to elucidate the mechanisms of their generation, which is why we have 300,000 plus papers looking at this topic. So now one interesting thing that I've come across in a number of papers is where are these things coming from, right? And a lot of the papers look at arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fat that you mainly get from animal products. And Spitaler is the first paper I've seen. And so often you'll find papers looking at atherosclerosis, and they will point out that this is a problem that involves arachidonic acid. It's the most reactive one, right? So that's kind of a fair place to start. What Spitaler points out is that the linoleic acid is also a similar fat and is almost as likely to oxidize as arachidonic acid, and it produces the same outcome, the same toxins when it oxidizes, but it's 7 times more common in the body than arachidonic acid, right?
Good point. Very good point. Yeah.
Right. So that most of the lipid peroxides that you see in the body, since there's 7 times as much and it's basically just as susceptible, are going to be coming from linoleic acid and not from arachidonic acid. And I came across another paper just this morning saying, again, looking at, arachidonic acid, and this one at least mentioned that this process can also be generated by 18-chain omega-6 fats. The 18-chain omega-6 fat is linoleic acid. But the paper never mentioned linoleic acid, right? So there we go again. So that's an important point that this paper makes, which gives you valuable context for when you see one of these papers or you see somebody making an argument, oh, it's really arachidonic acid, and that comes from animal fats, therefore you should eat a plant-based diet. That's not really correct, because we're getting so much more, plant fats than we are animal fats in our diet at this point.
Do you want to share your screen? That I found that point alone I found quite interesting, because I know there is, I'm not going to say the person's name, but there is a viral YouTube debunking of seed oils by a vegan doctor who won't call out his biases, and the whole thing is focused on arachidonic acid and not on linoleic acid.
Very good point.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I mean, yeah, that's right.
That's when they say seed oils are not inflammatory. That's their line.
Right. And one of these guys had Simon, what's his name? Simon Hill had a researcher on, and he made that point, and the researcher here, let me share a screen for a second here, because this is just so funny. All right, so do you guys see this?
Yep.
Your Twitter.
Okay, up at the top, omega-6 fatty acids lead to poor outcome with the DOI.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. So this vegan, Simon Hill, had the author of that paper on to talk about how seed oils aren't really a problem, and got spanked pretty hard.
And trying to cut back on the things which are really rich in linoleic acid and don't contain so much alpha-linolenic acid. So, some of the vegetable oils like, corn oil, sunflower oil, so on, don't contain much alpha-linolenic acid, but they contain a lot of linoleic acid.
And one of the funny things is he said, well, we're arachidonic, blah, blah, blah. And the guy was like, well, at this point, we basically what he said was, we eat so much seed oils that it's probably driven up arachidonic acid as high as it's possible for it to get. And the only way you're going to see an effect is if you cut way back on it.
You really have to lower linoleic acid a lot if you're going to decrease arachidonic acid.
Which is, of course, what we see in research like that done at the NIH by Christopher Ramsden looking at migraine headaches. So yeah, that was pretty amusing. And of course, if you're familiar with the stuff like what Spatella writes here, you'd be like, oh, well, of course, that's ridiculous that there's no relationship between linoleic acid and arachidonic acid, or arachidonic acid is the only thing we have to worry about, right? So the other thing that
So point number one with this paper is that don't focus on arachidonic acid. We've got these oxidized lipid products from lipid peroxidation that come straight from linoleic acid. So that's point number one.
Right. That's exactly right. The other interesting thing, especially when you're looking at the cardiovascular literature, is where is this happening, right? So the cardiologists will tell you that this process is starting in the atheroma, right? In the wall of the artery where the atherosclerotic plaque starts and is building. And how they explain this is that LDLs get sucked in, go in there because of a pressure gradient if they really don't know what they're talking about, and that something in there causes them to oxidize, and then it goes back out into the bloodstream. And so that when you see things like oxidized LDL in the blood, that it's coming out of the plaques that are in your body, right? There's many things wrong with that. But Spatella goes through and points out that this is happening all through the body, right? And he goes through a lot of the mechanisms of how this happens in the body, which are going to be outside the scope of this conversation, because I promised we weren't going to spend a lot of time talking about chemistry. So if you really are dying to get your nose
So-
into that stuff, you can do
so-
it in this paper.
As an aside, LDL oxidized is not just heart attacks. LDL oxidized is a lot of other things. We could do several other podcasts on.
Yeah, and I'm sure we will. Right. That's right. So he goes through some of the mechanisms, and one of the most important points he makes in here is something that it took me a long time to figure out by reading other papers. Doctors talk about cholesterol, right? Cholesterol being a baddie, right? The problem with that story is that that LDL is bad because it has cholesterol in it, okay? The problem with that story is that LDL has other things in it aside from cholesterol. And the other thing that it has, the thing that it actually has the most of generally is linoleic acid. That's the most common fat found in LDL and in VLDL. And it's bound to cholesterol because the body doesn't send fats out into the bloodstream on their own. It wants to bind them to something neutral so they can get to their destination. So it uses either proteins, right? Like albumin, which we can talk about, but albumin is the most common protein in the blood and a super important protein for health. The point of albumin is to bind to fats and transport them around the body, right? And lipoproteins, the point of a lipoprotein is to carry fat around the body bound to cholesterol, okay?
Because oil and water don't mix, everybody.
That's right, because oil and water don't mix. You have to mix the fat with something that will disperse throughout the blood and not form lipid globules all over the place, right?
You have to get chemically clever to make everything work around, to make everything work.
That's right. And our body is nothing if not chemically clever. So the cholesterol in your cholesterol per se isn't a problem. It's what they call a neutral lipid. It doesn't have a charge. It doesn't really react to anything else, but you can bind it to fats like linoleic acid. Unfortunately, and there's another paper that goes through all of this that we're not going to get into now. Spitaler mentions it in passing. Since cholesterol is transported in low-density lipoprotein, mainly as cholesterol linoleate, cholesterol bound to linoleate, and the latter is oxidized in atherosclerosis or inflammatory diseases, e.g. rheumatoid arthritis. A dramatic increase in the HOD contents, HOD is an oxidized linoleic acid model, is recognized, right? Now, this is what causes cholesterol to be a problem. The linoleic acid that it's bound to oxidizes the cholesterol. And oxidized cholesterol, just like oxidized linoleic acid, is toxic, right? And then when an LDL particle gets into your cells, one of the things that he talks about in this paper, the oxidized fats are stripped away and it leaves cholesterol, right? And the cholesterol that is left, if you have excess LDL being pulled into your blood because it's oxidized, is going to be what causes the cholesterol crystals in an atherosclerotic plaque. And this is why cardiologists think that cholesterol is driving atherosclerosis, because you do see these cholesterol crystals in there, but it's not the causative agent, right? It's what's left over when the damage is done.
Matt, are you following?
I am. The way you've described that is definitely not the way that I have described this to other people, but I'm wondering if it's because I simplify it or if I have misunderstanding. The oxidized LDL particle, by it being oxidized, is what makes it sticky. That's how I normally describe it. Yeah. And do you call that a foam cell or is a foam cell afterwards?
Well, a foam cell is a white blood cell. And
okay.
The job of the foam cell is to repair damage or clear infection, right?
Okay. Does a foam cell have a role in atherosclerotic plaque formation?
Yes.
Okay.
So what the white blood cell does is it tries to go clear either an infection or damage, right? Like if you get a bruise, it's going to get inflamed. Part of what's happening is that white blood cells are going there to clean out the damaged tissue, okay? The marker for that is very similar between, damage and oxidized fats. Typically, the damage is to the fats, and the oxidized fats are what's calling in the white blood cell, right? So what it does is it hoovers up as much of that as it possibly can with the idea that it's going to take it somewhere else and dispose of it, right? What seems to happen in atherosclerosis is that it takes up so much that it turns into a foam cell, and it's essentially unable, because it will take up as much as it can, basically until the cell dies. So then you're left with a bunch of necrotic white blood cells, these foam cells, in the wall of your artery. And if the process continues, it's going to build up, build up, build up to a point where your body just can't handle it, right? And that's when you start getting plaques breaking out. It's trying to heal the damage, which is the scarring that you get over the plaque in the wall of the artery. And when that basically, it's like a pus-filled cyst, bursts, it can send material up and block the heart or cause strokes or, whatever other nasty outcome.
So clinically, you can imagine a sprained ankle. What happens? Red, swollen, painful, warm, right? That can happen through damage, DAMP, damage associated molecular patterns. It can see that there's something damaged on a molecular level, or pathogen associated molecular patterns. That's DAMPs and PAMPs. So a foreign invader is no different than just everything messed up. The body says, time to clean it up. It's all messed up. It's not something we recognize. So a sprained ankle is similar to an infection, right? So looking at this on a small scale, we have either, and this paper brings up chlamydia too, which is interesting. But you on a small scale, even in our arteries, we can have damage or pathogen where the body's saying, this is not correct. We need to send the immune system in, which is why we can make analogies and talk about, how these are almost like autoimmune processes as well. So much.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Go,
The
Matt.
cliff notes here are that LDL cholesterol has a function. It's completely normal, supernatural, runs around your body. Great. Then we are consuming loads of linoleic acid. That does two things. One, that changes the composition of your LDL cholesterol in an unnatural way, such that it is more susceptible to being oxidized. And two, we didn't discuss this, but I'm going to assume linoleic acid and its byproducts then increase the level of oxidative stress in your body. So they are then increasing the amount of oxidative opportunity on the LDL. They both it's changing the actual material and then the way in which it's oxidized. And then that is what makes your LDL sticky and starts an atherosclerotic plaque, which is heart disease. And then your body's natural immune response in trying to clear that up exacerbates the issue, because it sends white blood cells, which then get fat and they get stuck there. And there's a recurring, just a cycle that it keeps going, but somewhere in there,
Right,
it's a normal cycle that should just work perfectly fine, but we stick in this almost synthetic, basically artificial material, linoleic acid, and it throws everything awry. But otherwise, your body's like a self-regulating system, and that shouldn't really happen.
Right. I mean, it's important to understand linoleic acid is perfectly normal. It's a natural part of most foods, right? Even things you wouldn't think of it being fatty have some linoleic acid in them, like, rice, for instance, has a tiny bit, right? And that's all perfectly normal. The problem is when you start getting this, as one of these papers mentions, a vast excess, then you start overwhelming the compensation processes, right? I mean, HNE we talk about as a toxin. HNE is also one of your body's signaling molecules, right? It calls in white blood cells, right? It causes your body to make new blood vessels, right? So that when you have an injury, your body is going to create new blood cells in to the area so that blood can get in there and the white blood cells can get in there and they can repair all the damage. That's great, right? Until you start getting, for instance, new blood cells growing into the back of your eye and the retina where they shouldn't be. And then you've got the leading cause of blindness in the world, age-related macular degeneration.
The neovascularization. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So
And
when you
sorry, keep going.
no,
Sorry.
no, it's neovascularization. So HNE is, linoleic acid and HNE are perfectly normal parts of the diet in your body in the right amount. It's when you start, as when we talked to Tony Hulbert in episode 15, was it? God, I'm losing count already. He talked about how your body can't really distinguish between omega-6 and omega-3 fats. And it expects to get a balance of them in the diet because that's what you find in nature is a balance between the two fats. And it's only when you start removing the omega-3 fats and then stuffing people full of omega-6 fats that you start getting out of balance and you start seeing all these problems.
And something else here, which is in my mind, is this paper. So I'm trying to think how I said this at this point. I have heard there's a whole nother discussion here about energy balance and calories in, calories out that I really don't want to have. But I have heard social media figures claim that actually the real issue with seed oils is that we just eat too many calories, and that in a calorie deficit, this doesn't really matter. You're gonna go through it, but this you're gonna burn through the material, and it's not that big of an issue. But this paper was written in 1998, like that. I don't know, that's 26 years ago, was not a time when people were seen to be eating ginormous amounts of excess food, I would say. I mean, we definitely
they were, but nothing like today.
You're making me feel
nothing
old.
like today. Yeah, nothing like today.
Yeah,
Nothing like today. So it's still like this is a fairly comprehensive paper done on the actual macronutrient profile, regardless of the energy balance piece of it. It's saying, hey, you put in arsenic in your body, even in a calorie deficit, like you're not going to be able to clear out the arsenic. The arsenic is going to do chemical things to your insides.
okay.
And imagine if there's arsenic in everything, so that every scientist believed that it was normal. There's arsenic in your breast milk. There's arsenic in all your food. It's just inevitable. There's arsenic in everything. That's exactly what's happening right now with high levels of omega-6. They're just assuming it's
even better. I read an epidemiology paper. I was trying to look into epidemiology and ubiquitous factors, right? Something that's everywhere. And this doctor, George, I think, or not doctor, professor, I think his name is George Davy Smith. If I get that wrong, I'll put it on the screen. Talked about, imagine two cities, one where smoking is illegal and nobody smokes, and then the other one, smoking is mandatory by law and everybody smokes, right? It'd be really easy to figure out what smoking does between those two populations, right? But if you're in the city where it's mandatory that everybody smokes, and then it's really hard because everybody's smoking. How do you determine, if everybody's smoking 2 packs a day, how do you determine that people start getting lung cancer after they have 1 pack a day, right? You can't. And that's kind of a funny analogy, except because, of course, smoking's not mandatory by law, but consuming seed oils almost is. Right? The dietary guidelines have caused, we talked about this with Chef Gruel, that everybody who goes to cooking school is now taught how to cook with seed oils and that any other fat is unhealthy.
And
right?
Starting as a baby, it's mandated that certain levels of linoleic acid are in the formula.
Right. Yep.
With a 10-day-old baby, I know that. That for
exactly.
Sure.
So at any rate,
the other thing I was going to mention here is, so this is as well, like specifically talking about linoleic acid. So when there's a discussion that goes on as well around like, well, really, the only danger is when it's a week old frying oil in a Five Guys. It's not that it's cold pressed canola oil, but even then, the inherent almost like molecular structure of linoleic acid is such that it is like so unstable. Even if you have it cold pressed and perfectly massaged and yada yada yada, it's still going to cause all this chaos inside of your body.
Well, that's a good segue back into the paper.
Yeah, and
because they talk about the
here's the quote.
enzymatic process.
Here's the quote. Although the initiating event for lipid peroxidation seems to be cell injury, it has to be kept in mind that the overwhelming amount of lipid peroxidation products is generated in non-enzymatic reactions induced by radicals. So an enzymatic reaction is your body realizes it needs some of the things that are caused by oxidizing these fats, right? And it does it. That's normal. The problem is in, for instance, your mitochondria or out in your blood, these things can happen without your body wanting them to, right? And if you are stuffed full of them, then it's much more susceptible for that to happen. Because if you have, free electrons going around or, superoxide going around, it's going to react with these fats if they're in there, right?
You're a
Or if they're in there
tinderbox.
in excess.
You're a tinderbox ready to catch fire.
Right. So, I mean, some of these arguments against, I've used another analogy, but I came up with a better one today. It would be as if you were to argue that nobody's ever shown that gasoline can burn things, right? Well, from a purely pedantic technical point of view, that's correct, right? Gasoline just sits there in a gas can and it's totally fine until it's oxidized. So if you exclude oxidized gasoline from, say, arson investigations, you're going to come to the conclusion, oh, gasoline's harmless. It couldn't.
You're telling me this wet liquid burned that building down?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And yet that's what we hear from nutritionists with PhDs on social media.
Well, the studies that show more wet liquid around are better than this burned down building.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yes, exactly. Because, if it's full of wet liquid, it hasn't burned yet.
Yeah. There's not much wet liquid left over.
Exactly. And the buildings with the lowest amount of wet liquid are the ones that are most susceptible to. So you need more gasoline in your, oh God, yeah, exactly.
Sorry, that we just took this real deep and philosophical.
No, it's fine. When the paper says radicals, is that referring to free radicals? Like that's what I would.
Free radicals, right?
Yeah,
right. Because right, those are produced in the body. I mean, mitochondria, is where most of that happens. And you have mitochondria everywhere in your body. And it's a slightly messy process, and your body has mechanisms to deal with some amount of it, right? It's just, again, when you start altering your mitochondria to the point where it's full of gasoline and you get a spark, you've got a problem.
All right. I think we're hitting some good major points here on that. That's excellent. I especially like what they call it, cholesterol linoleic.
Cholesterol linoleic, yes. The cholesterol esters, yes.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And that,
so cholesterol neutral, cholesterol oxidized, it can do things.
Toxic. Yes. Yes. So then we get into this thing called ferroptosis, which the term was invented in 2010. Ferroptosis was originally proposed to be this iron-mediated oxidation of polyunsaturated fats. And when I first heard the term, having read this paper, I got so pissed off about it. It's like, they're missing the point. That's a perfectly normal process. So the term ferroptosis, invented in 2010, we can read this paper written in 1996, and it describes ferroptosis, right? What happens? Iron catalyzes the oxidation of polyunsaturated fats, right? Well known, even before this paper, right? So then along comes this researcher in 2010 and notices that process. And it took them up until the last couple of years to figure out what you could have known by reading this paper, that it's not actually the iron that's the problem. It's the polyunsaturated fats, specifically the polyunsaturated omega-6 fats. And I just read a paper this morning that said, the fats that are most susceptible to ferroptosis are the omega-6 fats. It seems to make a real big difference between omega-6 and omega-3. And coincidentally, the omega-6 fats are the most toxic when they're oxidized, right? So there's now a whole literature, to get back into the frustration of terms, where you're going to read all these papers about the bad things of ferroptosis, and they'll never mention linoleic acid or omega-6 fats, right? And we're going through the same thing again. But if you read through this paper, he describes exactly how these fats can in fact liberate free iron, right? In the process of an enzyme coming out and saying, oh, we've got some damage here. We need some omega-6 fats to do whatever. In the process of enzymatically oxidizing the omega-6 fats, the iron can get freed and start non-enzymatic oxidizing the omega-6 fats. And that's when you start getting these runaway cascades of omega-6 fats oxidizing and causing damage throughout the body. And why is that important? Because we just had a disease all around the world called COVID-19, which killed you through acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a process driven by oxidized omega-6 fats in a runaway cascade.
We need to do an entire podcast on that, or 2 or 3.
Yes.
That's a great one that could get a lot of people's attention. I think.
I feel like I'd love to see someone explain that to me before I would dare say that to someone else without looking like a fool.
Yeah, seed oils made COVID worse.
Yeah,
seed oils made COVID bad.
And I not only did a long blog post on that, but I interviewed one of the guys who's done all the research on it, right? A gentleman by the name of Bruce Hammock, and I'll put a link to the podcast I did with him, not on this, prior to starting this up. So, so there's a lot of material there.
All right, to bring us back, to put this into perspective, when you have a house and you have a fireplace, it's a dangerous reaction, dangerous process that's controlled and beneficial to the entire home, right? So cells die, things happen, everything in your body is some sort of signal molecule, right? Everything is communicating in the cell or cell to cell. But if you have tinder, if you have newspaper and firewood 10 times as much as you need sticking out of the fireplace and touching the wall next to it, you're going to have an uncontrolled fire. You're going to have chain reactions that are uncontrolled, right? It's not in the fireplace. So when you have a diet that is, let's just round, 10 times as much omega-6 as what would be physiologically normal, what should be normal becomes pathologic, right? And that's a theme, I think, that we see throughout a lot of this.
Yes, that's an excellent point to make, an excellent summary. Matt, questions?
I don't have any questions on that one.
Okay. So HNE is what I always talk about. I kind of did a bait and switch on you guys, because the whole point of this paper is HNE is only one of these things. Right? Now
we're going to meet the whole,
and there's a whole slew of other things in here. One of the more interesting ones, 4-HNE is also generated from 2,4-decadienol, which I call DDE, just to avoid having to say that over and over again, which is a main secondary product of lipid peroxidation of 9-HPODE, which we won't get into. The yield of 4-HNE in this reaction increases with time and depends very much on the concentration of iron ions, okay? So why do we care about 2,4-decadienol, DDE, okay? DDE is one of these things that's produced from linoleic acid in your body, and it's considered by the US government to be a probable carcinogen. Oops. Right? That's a bit of a problem. Your body is actually making carcinogens from linoleic acid in your body, and it's one of the reasons why oxidized linoleic acid can directly cause DNA damage in your body, okay? That's a problem. HNE preferentially mutates the p53 tumor control gene in your body, and that's been shown in multiple different types of cancers. The most common mutation in cancer is a mutation in the p53 gene, and that is caused by, can be, let's be clear, can be caused by oxidized linoleic acid peroxides. So that's kind
So
of a good
that's actually
point.
called the tumor suppressor gene.
Yes. You want lots of
Because
tumor suppressor gene.
when you knock it out, you're more prone to make tumors. That's how important this is for the folks at home.
Well, and it's even more than that. I mean, lots of low carb folks have heard about the Warburg effect and the idea that cancer starts using a lot of glucose, and that's one of the things that allows cancer to get out of control, right? Well, the Warburg effect is controlled by the p53 gene. Right. So this, in order for the cells to go into the Warburg effect, and this is with cancer, there's a big spectrum, but one of the things that typically happens to allow a cancer cell to go into the Warburg effect is the p53 mutation. Okay, so
Okay, hold on. We spread that. We've got to do that again. So
Sure.
we're saying that there is a linoleic acid will break down into something else whose name I can't remember, which is a carcinogen inside of your body. That carcinogen knocks out or kills the tumor suppressing gene, or it mutates the tumor suppressing gene, and that then would allow the Warburg effect to occur.
basically,
Cool.
right. Right. So the p53 gene is involved in cell control, essentially, right? Making sure that cells are well behaved. And that's why it's a tumor suppressor gene, because what is cancer but a bunch of ill-behaved cells?
Huh.
I mean, think of it like as a key in a keyhole. P53 is the keyhole. There's only a certain mechanism by which you're going to go in there and chemically alter it, right? There's not 100 different ways, at least I don't think
I guess
so.
I had
Yeah.
thought of the carcinogenic effect on a human as like very separate from the Warburg effect and
Well,
and tumor growth.
yeah, that's definitely a whole nother long topic, but essentially,
They're both separate and can be related in the way that we've discussed it.
well, your mitochondria, most of the genes that control your mitochondria are in the nucleus of the cell, right? Including the p53 gene. And it's sort of like designing a computer system, right? You want a central processing unit that executes all of the commands all around the cell in a coordinated fashion, right? And the mitochondria are one of the things that's controlled by that process. So basically what you're doing is knocking a piece of code out of the CPU, out of the software that the CPU is running, and then you start getting wacky behavior all throughout the cell. To put it in computer geek terms, and I probably just totally lost Brian on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up okay. I like that way the framing.
So we didn't outline Warburg. So you said the low carb community. So that's its idea of certain cancers prefer glucose. Right. So eating a high glucose diet can be worse for certain cancers. But our point here is that the key turning that on and opening that door for that to become a problem is mediated by oxidized linoleic acid metabolite.
Can be. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And another, pardon me if I'm jumping ahead here. I'm just following some of our talking points for this episode here. Advanced glycated end products, right? That's another one where we have sugars, right? We blame sugars for things, but that's the fuel. Like, what is causing the spark? Like, what is causing the damage there? No, stop me if you have other points you want to make, but I know we're hitting on the big topics here, how this can segue into so many different things.
No, that's great. I mean, we covered a bit of the biomarker point already. And I think it's important when you're looking at biomarkers or you're trying to read a paper that's claiming a certain biomarker is important, that you need to use the right biomarkers for the disease process, right? And the classic example of that is ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, where in the course of ARDS, you see linoleic acid going down and 4-HNE is going up as the linoleic acid is being converted into 4-HNE and other linoleic acid biomarkers that you can use, which is what causes your body to, I mean, ARDS has a super high mortality rate. I don't know, Brian, you could probably tell, but they actually did a human study where they were looking at people in intensive care unit who were being fed soybean oil intravenously. And the mortality in the people being fed soybean oil was 7 times higher, right? It was so bad that they couldn't even finish the study because they realized how many people they were killing by pumping them full of soybean oil. And they had to and then, as they, during the course of the study, started dropping down the amount of soybean oil they were using, the mortality rate came way down. So yeah, it's a problem. It's good to pick the right biomarker if you want to understand these processes, right? And I guess, one of our nutrition PhDs would have said, oh, but the people who are dying had low amounts of linoleic acid in their body. So therefore, getting cause and effect backwards.
There's low amounts of wet gasoline in the burning building.
Yeah, exactly.
And I saw plenty of folks with ARDS, obese, and a lot of them lost weight during the whole process.
So what is ARDS? Say that again.
Acute respiratory distress syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay, and it can be caused by a variety of different things, not just infections and not just COVID. I mean, if you inhale vomit, for instance, that can cause ARDS, which is one of the reasons why aspirating vomit's such a bad thing.
Would that have any relation to asthma? Is that something else?
You nailed it.
Oh, no.
But that's going to be another topic. I'm not going to go into that one this
time.
Yeah.
Cool.
So this is us drawing a map for 100 different podcasts we can do basically today.
Right. But you're connecting good dots, Matt. Talking point 10, lack of interest. Products derived from arachidonic acid have been investigated in detail, including their physiological properties. Thus, a special journal is devoted to these compounds and their properties. In contrast, the physiological properties of linoleic acid products are poorly understood, and only a few data are available. Now, I'm convinced, as we mentioned before, that a lot of the reason for that is because there are so many people coming out of the Adventist medical schools and going throughout the whole universe of medicine, including to places like the Harvard School of Public Health, that they're focused on the animal products. And certainly in some places like the Harvard School of Public Health, they are suppressing research that shows that linoleic acid is bad. So at any rate, there's been a lack of interest in looking at this, despite the fact that most of these bad things ain't coming from arachidonic acid.
Yeah, because you have an idea before you do any kind of research, and where is this going to go? Think to the end of the paragraph, and it's, do we need to grow less corn and soy, right?
Right.
Right. You start messing with big money when you suggest such a thing.
Right.
And it indicts the plant-based world, right? Although honestly, it doesn't. When you look at monogastric animals, blah blah blah, we could talk about that. But what's exciting? What gets the headlines in academia?
Right, and I mean, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say there is something that was highlighted in this, you highlighted in this paper, that I tried to explain it to my wife, and then I realized I don't think I fully understand what it even says, but it looks like it's really interesting. And so I was going to ask, this is really my one question for this paper, which was on the PDF, it was page 37. On the paper, it's 141.
Okay.
It says, preliminary diet experiments carried out in our laboratory indicate that the influence of diet on LDL oxidation is highly dependent on age. About 12 to 16 hours after a meal rich in unsaturated fatty acids, young people aged 20 to 30 years experience none or only a moderate increase in cholesterol, 10 to 20%, along with 2 to 3-fold increase in lipid hydroperoxide. No, HOD, which is not the HOD, which is a byproduct, bad byproduct in LDL. By contrast, the same meal consumed by persons 65 to 70, also nearly no increase in cholesterol, caused an increase in HODs of 300 to 600%. What is that saying?
What it's saying is that older people are much more susceptible to seed oil toxicity than younger people.
So is that, I guess it's not concluding that it's necessarily like a compounding issue, but that if you were to get into an argument with someone in your family about this, you probably should pick someone older than younger. Like you'd have a higher ROI if you get it out of an older person's diet than a young person's diet.
Well, if they're younger, you could always give them one of the papers talking about how cancer is occurring younger and in younger people. I mean, a lot of what used to be called the diseases of old age are now happening in children. Right? And a lot of that, I think, is because of, yes, you're more protected from it, but, just like, the protection only goes so far. Your body is only capable of handling a certain amount of this. And it's important to understand some of the damage is thought to be irreversible. Again, I read another paper this morning talking about seed oils and epilepsy, Ferroptosis and epilepsy. And they are talking about how a lot of this damage is irreversible. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, certainly if it kills you, it's irreversible. So let's leave it at that, right? And one of the things that these oxidized seed oils are damaging are the things that detoxify oxidized seed oils, like glutathione and the ALDH gene that we talked about, right?
Yeah.
So if your detoxification system is being broken at the same time you're being poisoned, obviously that's bad. And the other interesting point is, what if we took a 65-year-old who had an evolutionary expected level of linoleic acid intake, and we did this test in them? Would they have the same result as an American who's been eating too much of this stuff their whole life? I would guess not.
Mm-hmm.
Good answer there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would posit that this would explain why people say they are more likely to gain weight as they get older.
Yeah, which is not a natural phenomenon in humans, right? Typically humans lose weight as they get older because they lose muscle mass because they have children and grandchildren to do all the work for them.
Yeah. It's not that you jogged more in college and all of a sudden you're 28 and ballooning.
Yeah.
Right. We can see here that there's this phenomenon, and I wish we had more data in front of us right here, because they use the example of age 20 to 30 and then age 65 to 70, and we essentially see a 1 order of magnitude, a little more than that, but 1 order of magnitude larger increase in these oxidized products. So that's a order of magnitude less ability to
cope with it,
to cope with this oxidation, right? And that you could extrapolate that to the damage done to your metabolism and everything. So
that's so interesting. I hadn't framed it that way. So for whatever reason, the older you get, the worse the byproduct breakdown of linoleic acid is in your body, and that can cause several things, right? It's not just like, oh, I could eat whatever I wanted when I was your age. Like, well, maybe you could, because your body didn't didn't react in the same way. There's the age component is so.
And they measured it. They've measured it. That's a good way to put it. We've measured the ability. We can see it right here. French fries in college is different than French fries when you're 40 or 50 or 60. Now, what does that graph look like? We don't have that in front of us. They have some more data somewhere, but they gave this example, which is fascinating.
Right. So the next one, I'm just going to throw this one out there because I have actually come in on this. Radiation. Similar products were found when, instead of radiation, hydrogen peroxide and iron ions were used to induce degradation of polyunsaturated fats. There's a really fun paper for weird geeky values of fun that I came across looking at what causes radiation sickness, done back in the 1950s. And it turns out it's oxidized linoleic acid.
Here
The
we go.
radiation damages the fats and causes them to become toxic, right?
Don't blame Oppenheimer. It's the seed oils.
Yeah. And there's a great story about the guy who came up with all the radiation exposure standards. I can't remember his name right now. He came up with the idea of curing athlete's foot by using x-rays, right? He would just basically bombard the fungus in his foot with x-rays until it was dead, right? And for a while, this was a way of treating athlete's foot. And, this guy lived to, if I remember correctly, 102. He was just fine. And you gotta wonder how much of that was because he didn't have a lot of polyunsaturated fats in his body to oxidize into these toxins. So at any rate, we'll skip over the radiation thing. It's just kind of a fun little note, but it's another example of how this paper contains so many little Easter eggs.
So probably natural cell death requires this destructive function of polyunsaturated fat, I'm sure.
To some, I mean, it's certainly not the only cause, but it can be a cause. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, when you're tearing down the old building, the old cell, which we do naturally all the time with damage or pathogens, right? It needs this. It needs that oxidized polyunsaturated fat, at least on a bare essential level. It's just a normal part of the destruction of cells.
Right. Well,
a small amount of it is.
The trigger of apoptosis is oxidized omega-6 fats in cardiolipin in the mitochondria.
Yeah, I remember that from the other episode.
Yeah. Okay. So then we have electronegative LDL. As a consequence of the transformation of basic amino groups in lysyl residues to aldehydic groups, the peptide becomes more negatively charged. Such an effect is observed if low-density lipoprotein is oxidized and was previously explained by assuming that the lysyl amino groups in the peptide component in LDL, ApoB, had partly reacted with MDA. And we may skip over MDA.
We're going to have to translate this. Everybody, we're talking about ApoB.
Yeah, in respect to the above outlined experiments, conversion of the amino acids of the amino groups to aldehydic groups must also be considered to be responsible for the loss of charge in oxidatively transformed LDL. Okay, so the first thing they noticed when they started understanding what oxidized LDL was that it was negatively charged. Okay. Why is this interesting? Because you will again read papers saying that ox-LDL can't be a problem because there's so little of it in your blood, right? And that's true. Fully oxidized LDL is pretty rare in the blood. The body cleans it out as fast as it can, right? But what's not rare in the blood is negatively charged LDL, electronegative LDL. In people with severe cardiac disease, 10% of the LDL can be negatively charged, right? So the cardiologist model of atherosclerosis, where it's starting in this teeny little plaque in your artery near your heart, there's no mechanism how that can explain how 10% of your LDL has become oxidized and negatively charged, right? It has to be happening somewhere else. Has to be happening somewhere else. Right.
Is there a way to test, like, how would you test the charge of your LDL cholesterol?
They do something called electrophoresis, which is basically putting the molecules in a charged environment, and the more charged they are, the more they move across this plate. So you can see that, this thing is neutral, it doesn't move at all. This thing is highly charged because it moves very quickly, and you wind up with this gradient of how oxidized things are, in the LDL universe determines how much they're going to move across this plate.
Can you put ApoB in context here? Because that's a key word that a lot of folks are talking about now. ApoB bad, need low ApoB, you need to take a statin.
Yeah, so ApoB, I mean, we did an interview with Dave Feldman where I think he's one of the guys who's really good on this stuff and is objective enough to not have his head in the sand. So ApoB is a protein in your body that is used to wrap up fats and cholesterol so that it can be conveyed around the body, right? Similarly, to go with the other end of the geek spectrum, in the internet, you have things like your email are delivered in packets, right? And every packet has an address on it. That's how the packet of information gets to where it's supposed to go. Well, ApoB is basically an addressing system for lipoproteins, right? ApoB coming out of your gut has one type of an address, a truncated address. ApoB coming out of your liver has the full address. And then there are some other proteins that are added in there. ApoE is another one, right? And it helps your body to route these things around the body to where they're needed. ApoB can become oxidized by the oxidized fats and the oxidized cholesterol in the lipoprotein, right? And one of the things that happens is your body recognizes these oxidized proteins as a PAMP or a DAMP, as Brian mentioned before, and starts to react to them and wants to clear them out, right? And if your LDL gets oxidized enough, so there's like a spectrum of oxidation in LDL, right? It's not like on or off. But what is on or off is it gets oxidized to a point where your body doesn't recognize it as LDL anymore. The ApoB is so damaged that it can't go into the LDL receptor and it starts going into other receptors, which is what makes a foam cell. The macrophage recognizes these oxidized LDL as so damaged that they're not LDL anymore, and it starts Pac-Manning them up.
Interesting.
So again, the point is it's not ApoB bad, it's damaged ApoB bad.
Right. ApoB, I mean, Dave said to me once, I think he was talking about how many LDLs are in your body at any given point, and it was something like quadrillions. So that's every LDL particle has a single ApoB molecule on it. So you're talking about quadrillions of these molecules. Your body's not out to kill itself with ApoB, right? I mean, people eating a non-industrial diet may have high levels of ApoB, but they don't get heart disease, right? It's a modern phenomenon. ApoB on its own is a normal part of your body. That's why you have quadrillions of it.
Like stars in the sky.
Right. So anyway, Spitaler goes through the core of this particle, the LDL particle, is an assembly of linoleic acid, esters of cholesterol, embedded in a monomolecular layer of phospholipids and a protein, ApoB, right? And then what happens is the linoleic acid disproportionately gets oxidized and it starts damaging the cholesterol. And that's what's driving, he says, therefore, the increase of cholesterol is a side effect of the much more important oxidation of the linoleic acid residue in cholesterol linoleate.
So
Cholesterol got framed.
if we ate less linoleic acid, would the makeup of our LDL cholesterol be different? Like the actual proportion of, the protein bit would be the same. The cholesterol bit would kind of be the same, but the lipo bit. So the makeup
fats
of the fats in your LDL cholesterol would be different if we ate less linoleic acid.
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the interesting things that didn't really come out in our discussion with Tony Hulbert is, we mostly talked about membranes and his research showing that the membranes want to be composed of a certain amount of polyunsaturated fats, but isn't super discriminatory between omega-6 and omega-3. That's not true for certain other parts of the body. And lipoproteins are carrying what you eat around the body. That's basically their job, right? So they're going to be directly impacted by what fats you eat, and the fats that you eat are going to directly impact how susceptible they are to this lipid peroxidation process. And that's been shown in humans multiple times.
Mhm. I don't know if this is right in the context of this paper. I'm trying to work on I'm trying to build a working theory here, which is, so I understand the modern development of heart disease, or atherosclerosis as we call it, is blamed on LDL cholesterol and ApoB, because you do need those things present. They need to be there, they need to be oxidized to create the plaque. But that's not, like, it's part of the equation. I'm assuming now as well, right? Like testing your LDL cholesterol is like an industrialized, super cheap thing to do. If you were to, how would you test someone's lipid profile that would have whatever LDL cholesterol and like no heart disease? Like, how would you show that they could have high LDL and not heart disease when
Like
it's
Tucker,
Well,
is this like the pattern?
yeah, there's
Hasn't
There's
Master John talked about this?
there's that, I'm not going to say his name, but like our favorite social media cardiologist that is just like LDL, 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 and
Yeah, causal.
I just
yeah.
don't.
Well, there was
What other tests could you run to show that person, if you had an example of a person with 270 cholesterol who eats only grass-fed beef and isn't oxidizing or rusting their cholesterol? Like,
well, that's what
how?
Dave Feldman is in the process of doing right now, is showing that you can have, he calls them lean mass hyperresponders, that they're people who, when they go on a ketogenic diet, they get super high LDL cholesterol. Like, from, I think the range is north of 5 times higher than a normal person. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, but it's a lot higher than a normal person. And so he is testing them to see if they have any evidence of atherosclerosis progression. And so far, the results have come back negative, that even though they have these super high levels of LDL, they don't have any bad outcome from it. And what's interesting to note is that there was a paper that came out in the 1970s looking at sled dogs, of all things, right? Because sled dogs are not meant to eat carbohydrates, and given the option, they avoid it. So these sled dog trainers put their dogs on a ketogenic diet to see how they would do. And some of them, their LDL cholesterol went through the roof, right? And they noted that it was genetic. And they also noted that it seemed to have no negative impact on the health of the dogs. So that's one way you would do it, right? You would put people on this diet, or find people who are on a diet that causes high levels of LDL, and see if they immediately drop dead of heart attacks, right? The other way you're going to do it is you're going to look at people. I mean, having LDL, having ApoB is genetic, right? There is actually a genetic disease where people can't produce ApoB, and they have all sorts of developmental defects, right? Severe ones. So ApoB is necessary in the body, right? So what you would want to do is look at, the same basic genetic pattern. Everybody who has ApoB has a gene to produce ApoB. And then you would want to look at different environmental factors and see if, the presence or absence of ApoB drives the presence or absence of death from cardiovascular disease. This was done back in the 1960s, and it was negative. And it was so negative, they looked at, I mean, the most shocking one was, they looked at white Americans, they looked at African Americans, and they looked at Africans living in Africa, right? Now, African Americans now have a higher rate of heart disease than white Americans. In the 1960s, they had half the rate of heart disease as white Americans. But the Africans still living in Africa had a rate of heart disease of 0. right? They still had ApoB. They had the same basic genetic pattern, but they have 0 rate of heart disease. And the conclusion of that paper was it's not a genetic disease. It has to be environmental.
I feel like I've definitely gone off on a tangent from this paper in this line of thinking. I'm almost wondering as well, like, I don't know if I should move this to another conversation or if we want to continue here, but it'd be interesting to find a good measurement for oxidative stress. I can empathize with the person who starts to see the I'm gonna be lost for words here, but like it starts to see different to the cult, the LDL cult, and says, no, I don't want to take a statin. I just want to eat food that like makes me feel and perform fantastically. But almost, I also understand the cardiologist's point of view, which is like, this is a nice idea, but we don't currently have a way of measuring how much damage you actually are doing. Because if you still have high levels of oxidative stress in your body, you are going to be damaging your LDL cholesterol and it will be atherosclerotic. So I guess I'm just talking gibberish, but like it would be interesting to see what a good measure for that would be in the future.
As usual, you have hit to the key point here, and you brought this up before, and I meant to drive it home. We do have several measures of oxidative stress in the body. They're all oxidized omega-6 fats. So the standard measurement in medical science for oxidative stress are oxidized omega-6 fats. That's why I keep talking about HNE, because that's the one that they use mostly. MDA, malondialdehyde, is another marker. It's not, for my purposes, as good because it can be made from omega-3 fats also, although in practice in the body, it seems to mostly be made from omega-6 fats. But yeah, the standard marker that's used is, so for instance, the definition of oxidized LDL is essentially LDL with oxidized omega-6 fats measured by MDA or HNE.
It would be interesting to see how feasible it would be to get like a continuous HNE monitor, basically. And be like, oh, my oxidative stress is through the roof. I should probably cut back on saturated fat a little bit today.
Well, that's really interesting. They're urinary markers of HNE excretion clearance. So you could definitely do that. You could, pee in a cup every morning and see what your oxidative stress level is. Obviously, you could do it in the blood. I don't know of anything that's available. I mean, in a doctor's office, there's an what is it called? OXPL/ApoB, which measures how many oxidized phospholipids are on an ApoB. So obviously the more the worse, the more oxidized it is. And that's a pretty good marker of cardiovascular disease risk.
Is this something that insurance pays for? Because I've never encountered it. I was in a clinic not too long ago.
Yeah, well, the problem is, who is it? Boston Heart does this test. I learned about this test from Dave Feldman. And they basically, anyway, I don't want to go into the whole history of that, but that's the best test. There's another test on the market for oxidized LDL called the Mercodia test, which is commonly used, but it cross-reacts with LDL, right? And Dave Feldman did a test on himself to see how his diet affected his ox-LDL, and the correlation between ox-LDL and LDL using the Mercodia test was 0.99, which is basically as high as you're ever going to see in a biological system. So, for instance, why is that important? Walter Willett at the Harvard School of Public Health did a paper showing oxidized LDL isn't involved in heart disease, and he used that bogus test. To his credit, back before it was actually, I think it had already been known that it was a bogus test at that point. But, again, back to you got to pick the right biomarkers.
Yeah.
So maybe that would be a good next. So this, or this paper that we've been looking at here that looks at other ones is almost for the purposes of this podcast is like us developing a word bank. It's showing people that there's many different terms that you need to be looking for, like 4-HNE, like HODE, the 9, the 13, and such. And that's how you're going to have to search out these papers, not vegetable oil or seed oils.
Right.
Because a lot of folks just pull up Google or pull up whatever, type in vegetable oil, seed oils. They're trying to find something, right? I get messaged all the time. And we want to get this point across so that people, are hearing here. But to make this is more abstract for the listeners. To make this more specific, we're going to have to dive in deep and say, hey, today, this episode today is about kidney stones. This episode today is about, erections. This episode today is, we could go on and say, here's papers 1 through 5 or 1 through 10 or whatever to make it exciting. And that's how we can help bring physicians on board, right? And other people, right? That are interested in this kind of thing. This is a very broad article.
Very
right?
broad.
But it opens the doors to all the other ones, which is interesting. So I love how this is calling out the name, because like we started to bring it full circle, the paper you brought up earlier that doesn't even mention linoleic acid. And it happens all the time, right? So what kind of conclusions do they come to in those papers? Hey, this is an interesting mechanism. We should look into it some more.
Well, generally they say we need to find some pharmacological method to control this outcome, right?
Yeah. That's the nod for thank you for the money. Yeah.
Yeah, and they never say stop eating seed oils, even though that would be the immediate way to do it. I mean, exactly. So the conclusion of this paper is basically a wonderful sentence. He says, thus a fruitful cooperation between chemistry, biochemistry, toxicology, biology, and medicine is required to evaluate the genesis of chronic diseases. And this is, I think, why there's so little progress in trying to figure out what causes these things, is that you have so many specialties that are siloed and never really look into some of these other fields. And, doctors, aren't, a doctor is trained in medical school to go and practice medicine. He's not trained to read all of these papers and understand them. Some of them do and go and do that and become, varying degrees of good at it. But that's not part of the training. They are told, this is what we think. Go out and treat people.
And in a litigious society, you stick to guidelines because it's layers of protection. That's what we're all doing. So you can't sue me for it, right? The FDA said this is approved for XYZ, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do because that's what we're all doing, right? If you have kidney stones, your urologist is going to tell you, okay, you need to drink a bunch of water.
Right. He's not going to tell you, oh, if you cut back on seed oils, your kidney stones might go away forever, as Bruno Croco, one of our colleagues on X, has discovered for himself.
Luckily, and I even heard a urologist say this in medical school when I was when I was in residency on a rotation with a urologist. He said, all the things that are good for your heart is good for your kidneys too. And I thought that was actually a great point. Now, he wasn't being specific, but most doctors will, at least now, I mean, I don't know how many decades ago you wouldn't have heard that, right? But now you are hearing that, and that's great. So I think that I think we're narratively winning on a lot of, us folks that say food is the most significant factor in health and chronic diseases, and controlling what you put in your mouth and what you swallow is going to be the main determinant for a lot of things. I think we're winning, but just getting specific, turning the levers and pointing people towards these things so that they can understand it, so they can be more interested in it, so they can share it, and also so that we can produce better human trials, to be honest, too. So we actually can control for these things. We can end with talking about what do we have good human data on is migraines, because it's easier, or at least, and it's more effective in the short term. You can cut the omega-6 out of someone's diet. You've got that half-life. You could bring it probably down to 50% within a reasonable amount of time. and the phenomenology, the symptoms that we see of these migraine headaches cuts down drastically. And it's these products, it's these oxidized products that we're having less of.
Right.
In this
Well, I
process.
mean, honestly, the best area that we have is cardiology and heart disease. I mean, the European Atherosclerosis Society paper on the mechanisms of cardiovascular disease that was released in 2020. If you read papers like this and drill through and understand, the only mechanism they offer in that entire paper is oxidized omega-6 fats.
Do they actually say that? Is it stated or is it hidden?
Well, it's hidden. They do have a chart showing where it starts and showing that it starts with ox-LDL.
Yeah.
But their link is to one of the papers. I think it's to the exact paper that's titled Beyond Cholesterol, where they showed that what is causing foam cells to form is oxidized linoleic acid. And they describe treating humans with olive oil instead of a seed oil diet and how that makes your LDL less prone to oxidation.
Well, let's do it. Let's go over that one.
Yep. So,
Excellent.
okay. I think
this is a good jumping board for a lot of folks that haven't heard these things.
Yep. Matt, any closing thoughts?
This was a dense paper, and I think this was a dense podcast. I feel like we took a good stab at doing it justice.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
It's a springboard. It's a springboard to a lot of things. It helps point people towards stuff and
it's I like the way I actually like the range of things that this paper touches on, because I think that one of the hardest spots, almost like what you were just saying, Tucker, one of the hardest parts of this conversation with somebody else is that you almost jump around. Like, do you agree on this thing? And do you agree on this thing? And do you agree on this thing? Then we need to start coming to this conclusion, which means that this is the conclusion. And then oxidative stress, and I like how much this paper jumps around and builds a good foundation on the linoleic acid front for sure. Yeah.
Great. Glad you guys enjoyed it. This was real homework. But I just got to the point where I felt like we couldn't continue down this path with doing a foundational episode.
This could have been episode 1 for the study group,
Yes, and we would have lost 100% of the listeners.
I know, right? Yeah, super nerdy. Yeah, episode 1 should have been boners or something,
Exactly.
Which is true. We could talk about erectile dysfunction, so which is
well,
an
now
early marker of coronary artery disease, folks.
Yep. Well, maybe we will do an episode on Viagra. Yeah. That'd be kind of fun.
Yep.
Because that'll really blow some minds.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Tucker. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, guys.